Hello there, and welcome to our sixth and final episode of Tales of Paranormal London. We've finally reached North London, so we'll be talking about the spooks of North London. Before we begin, my name's Rebecca, this is Gordon. We were both in real life tour guides we both racked up about 15 years, and we're now virtual tour guides, but we are a bit newer at that. Still getting used to it all. But we'll give it our best shot, and we're going to tell you some of our favourite ghost stories from North London. So yes, North London. For those of you not familiar with London, this is London, and the area of North London is where we're going to be hanging out today with the ghosts and the ghouls. We're starting out in an area of North London called Maida Vale, and Gordon has the first ghost story.
Yeah, in Maida Vale, we have the early 20th century paranormal investigator, Elliot O'Donnell. In 1912, he had heard rumours of a pig-faced ghost in a garden in Maida Vale and had set out to investigate. O'Donnell did encounter the creature and described it as human and yet not human, with long, bright yellow hair, steely blue eyes, a completely colourless face, and facial features like a pig. He describes more extravagantly frightening things in other investigations, often in such vivid detail and with such gothic horror that it's almost certain he's making it up. And in these stories, he says he maintains his calm, but this apparition in North London appears to have unnerved him. Mm-hmm. He brought a friend to the garden the next night, and the apparition appeared again. O'Donnell doesn't mention which house in Maida Vale, so we'll never know if the apparition continued to appear or indeed if the house still exists. We've learned in previous episodes about all the London Underground ghosts. We've only got a couple in this episode, but one of them is at Maida Vale Tube Station, where witnesses have felt an invisible hand placed over their own on the escalators. It's said that the grip is firm and pushes the hand down on the handrail. For those who have experienced it, say it doesn't feel sinister, but as though the spirit is trying to help.
Maida Vale was actually one of the first tube stations specifically built to have escalators in 1915. Maybe it's a concerned member of staff. The other tube ghost, since I've interrupted, is on the Bakerloo line in the 1980s, and this is Baker Street Underground Station. It was sort of near in this area of Bakerloo line. So in 1980s, they were a family were on the tube, and a woman took a photo of a younger relative sitting there. And when it was developed, behind them was an image of a man in an electric chair, kind of hovering above the boy's head, almost identical to the waxwork of Bruno Hauptmann, the serial killer in Madame Tussauds. Hauptmann was found guilty of killing Charles Lindbergh's son, although he protested his innocence right to the end. People have suggested that this was a double exposure, but the family say they hadn't been to Madame Tussauds. Some say it's a poster, but the image is not the same, and Madame Tussauds has no record of actually having Hauptmann's figure on a poster. So where this image comes from is really very strange. And there is a slightly odd epilogue to the story. Apparently, the family went to a psychic a few months later, not for herself. She just went because she's dropping a friend off, And the psychic came out to her and said, this is about the photograph you took. The man wants to say he didn't do it, which is a slightly odd epilogue to it, slightly spooky. Very weird photo. It doesn't look real at all, but if there was no poster like that, then what is it? Madame Tussauds, oh, sorry, I'm stealing Gordon's bit now.
Madame Tussauds was established in London in 1835 by Marie Tussaud, whose first waxworks were death masks of executed French aristocrats during the French Revolution. Like most museums, it's a spooky place at night. Staff have reported seeing ghostly figures emerge from the shadows in the staircase area, even when there's no waxwork there. The Chamber of Horrors closed in 2016, but it was said to be particularly troubling and people experienced strange things in the area. An 18th century highwayman was seen in the Chamber of Horrors, and people have heard heavy footsteps and experienced temperature anomalies. A cell door from Newgate Prison was on display, and it was said that people lingering near it experienced an overwhelming, inexplicable wave of fear. In the 1990s, the hair on the head of Hitler's effigy was found to be growing, so much so that staff needed to give the waxwork a haircut. Elsewhere in Madame Tussauds is the 4D cinema. People hear strange whispers in the room, although its round shape does give it rather odd acoustics. A menacing figure dressed in 1930s clothes is said to terrify all who see him, and this is harder to explain.
There's another museum in North London, not far away from Madame Tussauds, actually. Well worth a visit if you're ever in London, particularly if you're a music fan of classical music or indeed rock and roll. It's the Handel and Hendrix Museum in North London on Brook Street. So composer George Frederick Handel moved into Brook Street in the 1700s. Then 250 years later, in the 1960s, Jimi Hendrix moved in next door. Jimi Hendrix, quite soon after he moved in, he learned that this composer, this famous composer, lived next door, and he went out to buy some of his records. He said when he moved in, he'd never heard Handel's music before, but he did dig a bit of Bach, which is kind of cool. Months later, so we'd been in the house for months and months, a slightly patronizing journalist kindly informed him that, did he know, he lived next door to a famous classical composer. Hendrix said, yeah, he knew, thank you very much. He'd got some of his discs and he thought it'd be really cool to jam with Handel. So what's the ghost story here? The ghost story is that Hendrix said that he saw Handel's ghost. He said he was standing in front of his mirror, brushing his teeth, and he saw an old guy in a nightshirt and a pigtail behind him, go across the room behind him. This has been often laughingly, oh, well, you know, Hendrix wasn't exactly clean living, was he? So they've said it was a hangover or he was whatever drugs he was on at the time. But in 2001, when the two buildings were being made into the museum that's there now, the Hendrix and Handel Museum, two of the volunteers saw the same apparition or a similar apparition. And so they brought in an exorcist, which is a bit unkind. Handel lives there after all.
A fairly short walk away from the Handel and Hendrix Museum on Brook Street is the Langham Hotel, which is thought to be the most haunted hotel in London and one of the most haunted in the world. The hotel was built in the 1860s and is where, during the same evening in 1889, Oscar Wilde and Arthur Conan Doyle both received their first commissions. The hotel is said to have at least 5 resident ghosts. A man in a military uniform is seen to look out of a window on the 4th floor. He's also seen walking through walls and closed doors. The spirit is said to be the ghost of a German prince who died at the hotel during the First World War. A ghostly butler still faithfully attends to his duties on the 3rd floor, where a different ghost with a terrible wound on his face haunts the corridors. In the basement, the ghost of Napoleon III has been seen. Now, Napoleon III stayed at the hotel in the 1870s whilst he was in exile. In 2014, some of the England cricket team stayed at the hotel, and many of them experienced the hotel's resident ghosts. One of the cricketers said his room was inexplicably hot, and in the middle of the night, all the taps turned on in the bathroom. When he turned the light on to investigate, the taps turned themselves off. Then once he'd settled back down to try and sleep again, the taps turned back on. This pattern repeated itself so many times and unnerved him out so much that he asked to move rooms. The most haunted room in the hotel is room 333, where a man in Victorian evening wear appears usually in October. He's said to be a doctor who killed his wife in the room and then himself. In the 1970s, a journalist was staying in room 333. He saw a ball of light which morphed into the shape of the ghostly man wearing Victorian evening dress. The ghost stared at the journalist, then opened his arms and walked towards him. The journalist fled, of course. His description matches those of others who stayed in the room, although some guests in room 333 have also reported being thrown from their bed. The Langham is quite a posh hotel, but if you're a millionaire by this time next year and decide to stay in the hotel, perhaps avoid room 333.
I don't want to stay there. I think I'll avoid the whole hotel, actually, even if I could afford it. I think perhaps one of my favourite hotels, one of my favourite ghost stories, rather, in North London, is quite near to the British Museum, which, again, short walk away from the Langham, not far away. Behind the British Museum, actually. It's not actually the British Museum itself. Gordon will get onto that in a minute. Behind the British Museum used to be known as Montague Fields, and it was Fields, the name suggests. When it was when British Museum was Montague House. We can see the picture there. So it had the nickname, these fields had the nickname of the Brothers' Fields, or the Field of 40 Footsteps. So the story goes that in the 17th century, two brothers fought a duel to the death, and both brothers ended up dying in this duel. Some say the duel was over the fact that the brothers had chosen opposing sides in the English Civil War. Some say the duel was over a woman. But the legend persists that these two brothers died during a duel on Montague Fields, and their footsteps could never be erased. It didn't matter how many times they were sown over, that nothing would ever grow in the footsteps of these two poor brothers. For centuries afterwards, Londoners reported these footsteps in chronicles and diaries and letters, usually a lot more than 40, but it gained the name of the Field of 40 Footsteps, or the Field of the Brothers' Steps. It was last recorded in 1800. A chap named, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, Joseph Moser, went to have a look because he'd heard it was going to be built over. So he went to have a look to see if the brothers' steps were still there. He said, rather sadly, he couldn't see it. There were so many builders' footsteps that he had no idea which ones were supposed to be the mythical footsteps. And they were covered over, and that's it. They've never been seen since, obviously, under there somewhere, presumably. It was reported so many times that there must be some phenomena that meant that there were patches of soil where nothing would ever grow. But we're hardly likely to find out. We're not going to be knocking down the houses behind the British Museum anytime soon.
The British Museum itself is no stranger to spooky goings-on. The museum was opened in 1759 with its original collection, mostly that of Hans Sloane. These days, the museum's collection includes 8 million objects, including 6,000 human remains, alongside the remains of other animals. Staff have reported strange temperature drops, as well as orbs of light. People have heard the sound of strange music playing in empty galleries, and images of children not present at the time have been caught on visitors' photographs. In the basement, a female security guard described an unseen entity which reached into her body and grabbed her spine. She told her male colleague about it, who thought she was just being daft, and retraced her steps to assure her that everything was fine, only to experience the exact same phenomena. The most famous ghost is in a disused tube station below the British Museum. It was once part of the central line between Holborn and Tottenham Court Road. It opened in 1900 and closed in 1933. The station is said to be haunted by the ghost of an ancient Egyptian princess called Amen-Ra. Her screams can still be heard in the nearby tunnels and stations of the central line.
Quite near the British Museum on Great Russell Street, this is a slightly weird one, is the ghost of a magpie. In one of these houses, in one of the upper windows, between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., when it was still used as a residence, the resident would hear soft tapping on the window. When they went to the window to see what was the matter, they saw a ghostly magpie perching on a tree that didn't exist. If any noise was made, the magpie and the invisible branch would just disappear completely. So the ghost of a magpie, one for sorrow. Good afternoon, Mr. Magpie. How's your lady wife?
Indeed.
Sorry, for those of you who are not British, that's a very weird magpie superstition. I would just Google it. We don't have time to explain.
A short walk away from the British Museum is Red Lion Square. The square was laid out in the 1680s and named after the Red Lion pub on the corner. We heard a story in Maida Vale by early 20th century ghost hunter Elliot O'Donnell. He had a couple of stories about Red Lion Square as well. O'Donnell once borrowed a chair from a friend who said it was from a haunted house in Red Lion Square, and anyone who sat in it had a strange experience. O'Donnell took the chair home and at first noticed nothing except that his cat didn't like it. One night he heard it rocking violently in the night, and the next night he decided to sit in it. He felt a strange presence and saw a shadowy figure creeping towards him. The figure placed its hands on his eyes and gave O'Donnell visions of an 18th century murder in the house on Red Lion Square. The next day, O'Donnell returned the chair to his friend. During the First World War, O'Donnell and his wife stayed in a lodging house in Red Lion Square for a short time. One afternoon, O'Donnell heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs, stopping outside his door and then going back down. O'Donnell rushed after them and saw nothing except the front door opening and closing by itself. Others in the building said they'd had the same experience, and the caretaker said that his young daughter said she'd seen an old man with a white beard several times. O'Donnell heard vague stories about a tragedy, but never managed to glean any details before they moved away, and the building no longer survives. Since at least the early 20th century, the square has been haunted by 3 cloaked figures who walk across the square, not following the modern path, but one from centuries ago. And they are deep in conversation whilst they go. They are thought to be the ghosts of Oliver Cromwell, Henry Ireton, and John Bradshaw, whose bodies were exhumed, hanged, and decapitated after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. There is a legend that the bodies of the 3 men were kept at Red Lion pub before hanging at Tyburn, and that their bodies were secretly buried behind the pub, where the square now stands, and other bodies were sent to Tyburn in their place. This has never been confirmed, however, and without an archaeological excavation, we're unlikely to ever know.
Another short walk from Red Lion Square, south this time, would take us to Lincoln's Inn Fields. Lincoln's Inn Fields is one of the 4 Inns of Courts where we train lawyers and barristers. And there we go, nice old picture of it. In 1899, a 4-inch square lead tablet was discovered with numbers on one side and strange markings on the other side. Not the first one to be found in London or indeed the country, but there's the Lincoln's Inn Square. So on the 9x9 grid, on one side of it were numbers, and on the other side is written, the writing there is that nothing may prosper nor go forward, that Ralph Scrope taketh in hand, with some mystical names and some magical symbols. So clearly a curse against Ralph Scrope, poor old Ralph Scrope. Not poor old Ralph Scrope, he was a real person, lived in Lincoln's Inn in the mid-1500s, 16th century, and he was one of the governors of Lincoln's Inn Fields. So the curse, you know, didn't work. So curses were an example of black magic, and usually you'd go to a wise man or a wise woman to have the cursing square made, but some people would do it themselves if they knew the doing of it, to save a bit of money. The tricky bit seems to be the numbers on the one side. It's kind of like a supernatural Sudoku. So you have to have all the numbers adding up to, what is it? Can't remember what it is now. You have to have them add up to a particular number, 369, that's it, 369. So they all have to add up to 369 without any repetition of numbers. The Lincoln's Inn cursing square is wrong. There's an error in it, which is maybe why Ralph Scrope's curse didn't work. So yes, a supernatural cursing Sudoku. Maybe don't try that the next time you do a Sudoku in the metro, though, you know, just in case. You never know.
One of the most famous paranormal events in North London is probably the Enfield poltergeist. This was covered on national television at the time, I seem to recall, for those who want to track it down. In 1977, a family on Green Street in Enfield reported seeing furniture moving and hearing knocking sounds. After investigations, it seemed that much of the activity was centered on 2 of the children, 2 girls aged 11 and 13. During the next 18 months, witnesses, including police detectives, journalists, researchers, and investigators, witnessed furniture moving, objects being thrown, knocking noises, a gruff voice, and one of the 2 girls levitating off the ground. Many investigators believed the entire thing was staged by the 2 children, and that one of the children had taught herself ventriloquism to create the gruff male voice. Investigators from the Society of Psychic Research, Morris Gross and Guy Playfair, admitted that some of the activity was faked or exaggerated by the children. The 2 girls even admitted playing pranks, particularly on journalists. But Gross and Playfair still believed there was some poltergeist activity at first, but the girls had invented most of the latter activity as the media attention grew. By 1979, the activity, whether faked or real, ceased. It's perhaps worth mentioning almost exactly 100 years before this haunting, hit the national media, the residents of a house a few streets away in Enfield reported that they heard knocking and scratching on the walls that had no obvious source and were so loud that nobody who stayed there was able to sleep. I wonder if another poltergeist will strike Enfield in the 2070s.
Repetitive ghosts, repetitive poltergeist. One open space in London that has some slightly odd paranormal events, kind of not hugely far away from Enfield, is Oak Hill Park. So Oak Hill Park has another of those regular ghosts. So Gordon was suggesting that maybe the poltergeist in Enfield only occurs every 100 years. The ghost in Oak Hill Park only occurs every 6 years. So every 6 years, usually around Christmas time. So coming up soon, if you want to go and stake out Oak Hill Park. The ghost of the 12th century knight, Geoffrey de Mandeville, rides on his horse across Oak Hill Park in full medieval armour. He's seen galloping towards a church, St. Mary the Virgin, and disappearing through its walls, although that's not where he's buried.
There was once an old oak tree on Oak Hill Park near Churchill Road. In the 1930s, on a clear summer day, the oak tree suddenly burst into flames for no visible reason. There was a strange enough cause of arboreal spontaneous combustion, but it was under the same tree that, legend has it, 18th century self-proclaimed prophet Joanna Southcott had a vision, telling her that she was the woman of the apocalypse from the book of Revelations. Southcott gained many followers in her lifetime and left a sealed wooden box containing her prophecies. She said that it should only be opened in the presence of 24 bishops of the Church of England at a time of national crisis. In the 1920s, paranormal investigator Harry Price claimed to have Joanna Southcott's box and that he'd opened it to find it contained nothing more than a lottery ticket and a pistol. Followers of Southcott, of Southcottians, as they're known, insisted later in the 20th century that Price's box was a fake and that they had the real Joanna Southcott's box in a safe place and would only reveal its secret location when the meeting of 24 bishops had been arranged. So we might never know if any of Southcott's prophecies have come to pass.
Don't think the Church of England will be rushing their bishops to that meeting soon. Another North London open space, Regent's Park, has a couple of glowing ghosts, weirdly. In 2010, a glowing figure of a person was seen by someone walking through the park. The person who saw it fled terrified, but the person who was walking with them didn't see anything at all. One of those strange ghost incidents where two people in the same place, one sees something different to the other. Decades earlier, in the 1930s, a zookeeper at London Zoo was walking through the park after work with his granddaughter and saw the glowing image of a lion in the park. At the time, one of the lions at London Zoo was ill, and when he returned to the zoo the following day for work, he discovered that overnight the lion had died, perhaps when he saw that glowing lion's spirit in the park. London Zoo itself is home, well, the aquarium is home to a ghost called the Whistler. Kind of gives away that the ghost is heard whistling. One of the engineers of the aquarium, it's said to be, in the early 20th century. He always whistled while he worked, and he was very cheerful, and after he passed away, his whistling could still be heard in the aquarium. the people who hear it say it's so real, it sounds so real, that they expect that when they turn that corner, there's going to be somebody else walking towards the corner. And of course, when they turn the corner, the whistling stops and there's nobody there, which is very spooky. Elsewhere, the zookeepers sometimes catch a glance of someone wearing a Victorian keeper's uniform sweeping up. Again, thought to be a 19th century keeper who loved his job at the zoo so much he could never bear to leave it. Kind of a dream job for a lot of people at the zoo, isn't it? I couldn't actually find any animal reports of animal ghosts at the zoo, but not far away from London Zoo is Camden Market. The stables, this used to be used as stables for hundreds of horses up until the mid-20th century. And the stall owners, the stall runners at Camden Market do sometimes say that they can, when it's very early on, they've just arrived to set up their stall, they can hear the sounds of horses. They can hear them kind of whinnying and chuffing and their hooves on the cobblestones. There's no horses there now, of course, apart from these fine statues. And not far away again from London Zoo or Camden Town is Primrose Hill. Primrose Hill is one of the locations in London where Druid ceremonies are held. So Druids, this is Primrose Hill, lovely view, great place to go. Druids were the religious figures of pre-Roman Britain, so the Iron Age Celts. They're completely wiped out by the Romans, in England at least. In 1717, historian John Toland decided that he would try and reenact some of the ancient Druidic ceremonies as much as he was able to glean from historical documents. And ever since then, it has been used. Primrose Hill seems to have been chosen. There's a legend that it contains an ancient burial mound, that Primrose Hill is an ancient burial mound. So the theory is that it has links to the Iron Age Celts, and Druids used it even before the Romans arrived. There's no proof of that, but I mean, Iron Age Celts did hang around the general area of London, so it's not impossible. Poet and artist William Blake was actually a member of the ancient order of Druids. Some claim he was actually a leader. And he did go to Primrose Hill to see the equinox ceremony in the autumn equinox at Primrose Hill. He wrote, "I have conversed with the spiritual sun. I saw him on Primrose Hill." And so he was definitely there. Druids still go to Primrose Hill every year at the autumn equinox and other sites around London as well.
London has a few sites which are said to be sacred, most of which are linked by ley lines. Several of these ley lines converge on Hampstead Heath. There have been countless ghost sightings in Hampstead, and nearby Highgate, including the ghost of the science fiction author H.G. Wells at his former home on Church Row, Hampstead. We'll just tell you about a few of Hampstead and Highgate's spooks. The Spaniards Inn was built beside Hampstead Heath in 1585 and was said to be popular with highwaymen because they could keep an eye on the coaches in the yard and decide which one to rob as it crossed Hampstead Heath. We've had the ghost of Dick Turpin in almost every episode, so it'd be a shame not to get one in North London. It's said that Dick Turpin stabled his horse Black Bess at the Spaniards Inn, and in the 1970s, the landlord said he was certain that Turpin's ghost was haunting his pub, although he only seems to have reported strange noises. So I'm not sure how he knew it was Turpin. Other spirits have been reported at the Spaniards Inn. A lady in white has been seen in the gardens, and those drinking at the pub have felt someone tugging at their sleeve. On Hampstead Heath itself is a mound known as Boudicca's grave, although it's more likely to be a Bronze Age burial barrow, predating the Celtic Queen of the Iceni by many hundreds of years. On the other side of the heath used to be the Gibbet Elms, 2 elm trees where highwaymen were hanged, their bodies left hanging in chains. The last gibbet elm was blown down by a storm in 1907. Perhaps it's the ghost of that unknown Bronze Age Londoner or the unfortunate highwaymen who haunt the nearby streets and pubs.
Mm. I'm nipping off to Highgate for my ghost, the Gatehouse pub in Highgate. Nice old pub, dates back to the 17th century at least, possibly older. The site certainly is older. A former landlord left abruptly after seeing a horrific apparition in the upstairs room of the pub that was so terrible, the landlord was actually taken to hospital suffering from shock because what he'd seen was so awful. The vision of a Jacobean man has been seen in the pub as well, said to be accompanied by people say they feel like they're choking when they see this strange ghost. And a woman known only as Mother Marnes, who was murdered for her money in the 17th century. She wanders the pub building with her pet cat at her side, so whoever said cats aren't loyal. In 2012, ghost hunters said that they had contacted the ghost of Francis Bacon at the Gatehouse pub in Highgate. Francis Bacon died of pneumonia while he was in Highgate in 1626. He'd caught a chill while he was doing an experiment in freezing meat. He was in a carriage and he had this brilliant idea about how you could freeze meat. So he jumped out of the carriage in Highgate, he got some snow and stuffed it all inside a chicken, a dead chicken, obviously, to see if that would keep the meat fresh, keep the chicken's meat fresh. Sadly, just this scientific experiment Bacon conducted left him with a chill, pneumonia or something, and the poor man died a few days later. Since not too long after that, actually, the ghost of a chicken has been seen in Pond Square in Highgate, and people say that it is Francis Bacon's chicken that is still seen scampering around Pond Square.
One of the most famous paranormal incidents in London took place in nearby Highgate Cemetery. The cemetery was opened in 1839 as one of the Magnificent Seven cemeteries. Highgate Cemetery's tombs are an eclectic collection of styles, and it had become somewhat dilapidated in the early to mid-20th century, lending it even more of a Gothic horror look. Local legends of ghosts were common, with sneaking in and knocking on a particular haunted tomb a rite of passage for school children. In 1970, David Farrant wrote to the local newspaper to say that he'd seen a ghostly figure on Swains Lane in the cemetery several times. Lots of people wrote in reply with their own spooky sightings in the cemetery. An expert on the occult declared that these sightings were in fact a vampire. Over the next few years, hordes of amateur vampire slayers armed with stakes and crosses descended on the cemetery, with some breaking into the then closed cemetery. It's even said that these probably well-meaning vampire hunters damaged tombs and desecrated graves. Rumours also began to spread that evidence of black magic being performed had been discovered in the cemetery by the hunters. One of those who led a group of vampire hunters said that he had personally fought with and killed 2 or 3 vampires in Highgate Cemetery using stakes, garlic, and a Latin curse, and that North London would be safe now. Shortly after the vampire scare, Highgate Cemetery was taken over by a charitable trust who have tidied it up and restored it to a working cemetery once again. There have been no further reports of vampire activity, and in fact, the group have now added a stipulation that anyone who wishes to visit the older part of the cemetery must apply for permission in advance from this group. Many years ago, I was involved in the making of a documentary about the vampire subculture in England, during which we were to interview David Farrant, who had been one of the vampire hunters in Highgate. The producer and myself traveled to his house, filmed our interview, and were packing up to leave. The producer was saying a few final words of goodbye, and I was waiting somewhat impatiently in the hall with all the gear. I glanced up at the stairs and noticed one of the cats sitting very still and alert. I then noticed there were actually several cats lined up at the top of the stairs, similarly tense. As I watched, all of the cats appeared to be watching something as it moved across the hallway. I've seen one cat do that before, but not 4 or 5 cats all at the same time. When the producer came out to help me carry everything to the car, I pointed at the cats. We couldn't see a bug or a fly or anything else, but the cats were intently watching an invisible something as it moved down the hallway towards us. The atmosphere in the hallway suddenly became very claustrophobic and sinister, so we quickly gathered up our gear and got in the car and drove, perhaps rather too fast, back home. But John was certainly spooked, and he didn't believe in ghosts.
Yes, cats freaking people out since forever. Well, thank you very much. That was our last Tales of Paranormal London episode. We've got lots of other ideas of stories that we want to tell about London. We've got, between us, 25 to 30 years of London trivia in our heads, and we want to get it all out there and tell you all about it, all our great stories. If you've enjoyed these videos, please do like and subscribe. We're going to be putting other videos up as soon as we can. And if you can, go to www.londonhistoryathome.com and make a small donation to the Multiple Sclerosis Society. We'd very much appreciate that. Thank you very much, and sleep well.